to the Niskanen Center briefing on original research, how our work impacts climate, immigration, and poverty policy. I'm Kodiak Hill-Davis. I'm the Director of Government Affairs at Niskanen Center, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with Niskanen, we're a 5-year-old 501c3 think tank based in Washington, D.C. And while we are nonpartisan, our policy work focuses on market-based solutions and promoting an open society. There's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we encourage all attendees to feel free to submit questions throughout the presentations, and we'll get to those at the end. Today's panelists are my colleagues, Jeremy Neufeld, Shu-Ting Pomerleau, and Robert Orr. They'll be discussing the recent research efforts as we influence policy promotion in Washington, D.C. Jeremy is an immigration policy analyst. His work has been cited by The Hill, MSNBC, and Bloomberg. Shu-Ting is a climate policy analyst with a master's in public policy focusing on environmental and energy policy. She's working on our carbon tax platform. And Robert is a welfare policy associate, an economist by training, and his research focuses on welfare, healthcare, and economic development. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jeremy to get us started.
Thanks, Kodiak. I have some slides that I will pull up right now. All right, so in the first part of my presentation, I'll cover the most recent research paper that I've released, which focuses on optional practical training, or OPT, which has become newly relevant as our policy work responds to an upcoming administration order that would move to curb this program. And in the second part of the second part of my presentation, I'll talk about a forthcoming paper that I have coming out about subjective well-being research and how it can inform immigration policy. So optional practical training, just a little bit of background, is a program that's been around since the 1950s, which allows international students to stay in the country on their student visas after they graduate for a limited amount of time to gain on-the-job experience. But it also acts as a recruitment and retention program for high-skilled migrants. The basis of this study was looking into DHS data on OPT participants and where they work. So I was able to submit a FOIA request, which I got back on 1.7 million OPT participants from 2004 to 2017. Which gives us a picture into where they work, what their skills are, what their educational attainment was, who their employers are. The first thing to note is just how much the program has grown since over the period for which I was able to obtain data. So from 2007 to 2017, it grew by almost threefold, from 77,000 at the beginning to nearly 250,000 for 2017. And for comparison, this shows how it's even a larger recruitment program than the H-1B program, which is usually seen as the only relevant high-skilled recruitment program. And while H-1B is larger at any given time, because the visas last longer, we can see from this that new OPT recruitment, which brings new individuals into the labor force, dwarfs H-1Bs by almost 80,000 each year. And so while H-1Bs might be necessary to retain those workers, OPT is very important in recruiting them in the first place. But a program of this size raises obvious questions about what the economic impact of this is. Are they as highly skilled as one might hope? Are they displacing natives? And luckily, my research was able to investigate these questions as well. First, just looking at what their educational attainment is, we can see that over half of them have received master's degrees from US institutions. Bachelor's degrees made up 24%, and doctorates make up 13%. And while the majority of OPT participants have always been graduates with master's degrees, the proportion of OPT participants who graduated with a master's degree has been on the rise from about 53% in 2004 to over 70% in 2017. And meanwhile, the proportion of those with doctorates has hovered fairly consistently around 10%, but the proportion of bachelor's degrees has shrunk as it's given way to those with higher educational degrees. From about 30% for under bachelor's in 2004 to 18% in 2017 as the numbers of, as the proportion of master's degrees has increased. And so we see right off the bat that these are highly educated individuals. And specifically, when we look at their fields of study, we see that they're highly concentrated in STEM fields. We find that the most common fields of study over the period were computer science, business administration, electrical engineering. And if we look at the trends within those fields over time, we see that there's a shift away from business fields and towards STEM fields. To give an illustrative example, in 2004, 12% of OPT participants had degrees in business administration and management, and only 8% had degrees in computer science, whereas by 2017, 14% had degrees in computer science and only 5% had degrees in business administration and management. In 2004, business administration was the single most common field of study, and it's fallen to 4th place by 2017. Here we can see the geographic distribution of employed OPT participants. As one might expect, that they're concentrated in regions with higher populations, largely along the coast, but there's also major exceptions. And we see high growth in OPT participation in smaller states where there are burgeoning tech hubs and other innovation hubs. Michigan, Washington, Georgia, Arkansas, and Iowa have seen the most growth in the levels of OPT participants. And while we would expect metropolitan areas like New York and San Francisco to get a lot of them, and they do, we also see that Dallas, Houston, Atlanta, Detroit, Philadelphia, Phoenix, Austin, and Baltimore are also getting lots of new OPT participants and are seeing their OPT participation grow as they contribute to local economies and reinvigorate those kinds of cities. Now, the paper also investigates the effect of all these OPT participants in the labor force. Determining the causal effect is a challenge because just looking at the geographic distribution doesn't necessarily tell you much, because while OPT participants might contribute to the economic activity of a region, they're also attracted to places where there is more activity, more hiring, better firms, and employment prospects. But we were able to get around this by two main methods. The first is using a new rule that established the 24-month STEM extension, which allows which lengthened the amount of time that STEM OPT participants could participate from 1 year to 3 years, which dramatically increased the total number of OPT participants exogenously. And then the second way that we were able to do it is by looking at existing networks of OPT participants, colleges, and employers that attract OPT workers. And so by looking at the OPT workers in a given region in a given year, you can use that to have an idea of what the number of OPT participants will look like in the following year, and then deviations from that. If we treat those as random shocks, we can use those to estimate the causal economic impact of OPT participation. And what we find is that they're a win-win proposition for employers, for the participants themselves, and for the regions that receive them, to the natives who work there. So on just innovation grounds, we see that they have a strong, positive, statistically significant effect on innovation as measured by patenting. both directly through patents that they are working on and by making teams more productive and more likely to generate patents, even if the individual themselves wasn't the one generating that patent. And we also see that as far as whether they're competing with natives, that's not borne out in the data. Their average earnings of natives increases from OPT participation in the region, with the strongest effects for people who would be on similar teams as them, so people with graduate's degrees or bachelor's degrees. And then looking at whether those earnings bounces are outweighed by effects on employment. We also investigated whether there's any effect on labor force participation, employment or unemployment, and there's no statistically significant effect. And so as we hear lots of discussion about phasing out this program or ending it in the hopes of saving natives, we hope that research like this can help counter those narratives and demonstrate that ending the program is likely to hurt natives because the program is supporting their jobs and supporting their earnings, and showing that they complement native workers. The forthcoming paper that I have coming out, which is a little more abstract, is a new paper on subjective well-being and the new research that's been done on that, and specifically what it tells us about migration. So the bread and butter of economic analysis of migration is typically objective well-being, looks at GDP, earnings, productivity. And economists are the first to say that these measures aren't perfect, and they might not get at subjective well-being. And so they've offered a couple of alternatives to objective well-being measures. One of them has been to come up with new indices or metrics for welfare outside of GDP per capita, things like the Human Development Index, or alternative measures that include things like life expectancy, education, and things that aren't included in national income. And what we see when we look at those measures, is that they're highly correlated with GDP per capita, 95, 98% correlations. So they don't necessarily tell us that GDP is all that far off from a subjective welfare measure. But economists have also started looking at subjective well-being by just asking people how happy they are, how they would say their day is, or how satisfied they are with their life on a scale of 1 to 10. And just asking them directly has been a new approach termed happiness research, and it's revealed some interesting things about migration that can help inform immigration policy debates that the more traditional objective well-being standards can sometimes miss. So the first thing that economists have done in happiness research is just looking at what are determinants of happiness outside of income. And you can do that with a cross-country analysis like this paper will report on. And we can see that social support, life expectancy, equality, freedom, the lack of corruption in a country are all important determinants of subjective well-being. And especially the social support one has direct implications for immigration policy, because the potential happiness gains to the migrants themselves and to US citizens with family members living abroad is dependent on their family. In fact, more so than is their income. And it lends some support to the idea that a focus on family-based preferences should play some sort of role in determining admissions policy. But we can do better than cross-country analysis. We can look at how foreign-born people subjectively report on their subjective well-being after they've immigrated. And you can imagine that presumably the fact that they migrated in general means that they would have only decided to do so if it would make them better off. But we can see from subjective well-being data that the amount that they're made better off is close to that of their destination countries, but not quite. So there's some residual effect from their home country, which we can see by the fact that when we plot native-born happiness against foreign-born happiness, that they're fairly highly correlated, but the slope is slightly less than, it falls slightly under the 45-degree line, and so there's some sort of drag based on what their home country is. And again, this can help inform admissions policy when we're thinking about which kinds of countries to take immigrants from, and to maximize the happiness gains. This also allows us to investigate whether people that are left behind and natives in receiving countries are made better or worse off by immigration, and ways that that can be improved by tweaking immigration policy. The last thing the paper does is it looks specifically at the United States case, and looks at the various immigration and temporary worker programs to see which of them are likely to improve the subjective well-being of migrants and natives, and which of them aren't. And as we can see here, diversity visa and refugee program are very likely to greatly improve the happiness of migrants. And then what might be more surprising is that the O visa, the L visa, and the various E visas are also correlated with the well-being of migrants. Before I close up, I'll just mention that one of the other major lessons that we can learn about immigration policy from subjective well-being research is that migrants themselves seem to rate the importance of family and social support much more highly than they, as a determinant for their own happiness, than they do their permanent status. And so to the extent that there's a trade-off between offering people permanent status and the number of people who you're allowed to admit, that if we're concerned about the welfare of the immigrants or migrants themselves, that focusing on the latter and not on the length of status or the rights that are afforded to them it would be important in maximizing the amount of the happiness gains that can be had from migration. With that, I can turn it over to Shu-Ting to talk about their research and climate policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. I have a couple of slides as well. Let me pull them up quickly. Okay, can you all see my screen? Good? Okay. Thank you to everyone who take the time to join our virtual meeting today. At the Niskanen Center, one of our goals is to help policymakers understand different design choices of a carbon tax policy. Part of that is to figure out what a border adjustment mechanism should look like. Border adjustment is a very critical component for a carbon tax. Out of the 8 carbon tax bills introduced in Congress last year, 7 of them cover a section of border adjustment. Later in this presentation, I will show you a table that gives an overview of different bills' border adjustment design. In the following presentation, I will walk you through 3 sections. First, I will talk about what is a border adjustment, and then I'll explain why it's important for a carbon tax. And lastly, I will highlight some key design issues for designing a border adjustment mechanism. Okay, so what is a border adjustment? A border adjustment is a mechanism that ensures all goods and services sold to consumers within a jurisdiction are taxed. It works by applying a tax on imports and a rebate on exports. So if you think about it, imported goods, they are for domestic consumption, therefore they're taxed. Exported goods, they're for foreign consumption overseas, therefore they should be exempted from the tax. Actually, a border adjustment is widely applied around the world. The most common example is a border adjustment used in value-added taxes. We usually call it a VAT. A VAT is a sales tax collected in stages through a production process. The United States, we don't have a VAT, but our state's retail sales taxes, they're actually implicitly border adjusted. And what does that mean? Let me give you an example. Say for example, a pair of sneakers that are produced in Maine, but are purchased by a consumer in Ohio. The pair of sneakers would not be subject to the sales tax in Maine. Instead, they will face the sales tax in Ohio. Likewise, a pair of sneakers produced in Ohio, sold to someone in Maine, would be subject to the retail sales tax in Maine instead of Ohio. It's the same with all other goods. Goods, no matter where they're produced, as long as they're purchased within the same state, they face the same tax rate. Another very important concept to keep in mind about border adjustment is they're trade neutral in principle. That means they neither discourage or encourage imports or exports. Now, you might ask, wouldn't imposing a tax on imports actually discourage imported goods, actually discourage imports? No, it wouldn't discourage imports because the imported goods and the domestically manufactured goods, they actually face the same tax rate. Now I will walk you through quickly why is border adjustment important for carbon tax. There are two main reasons. The first one is to prevent carbon emission leakage. What does leakage mean here? If the US were to implement a carbon tax right now in the country, then as a US domestic manufacturer, I would have the incentive to just shift my productions overseas to a country with either no carbon pricing policies or less strict carbon pricing policy in order to avoid paying the US carbon tax. So instead of producing the goods in the United States and generating emissions here, I produce the goods overseas and then generate emissions there. As a result, the overall emissions would not be reduced in this case. That defeats the purpose of the carbon tax. So we wouldn't want that to happen, and a border adjustment is a great way to solve this issue. Another reason is it helps preserve US manufacturers' competitiveness against foreign manufacturers. So what this means is it applies to both imports and exports, both ways. A border adjustment ensures that importers and US domestic manufacturers face the same level of tax rate when they sell to the domestic consumers. And then US exporters, they're exempted from the tax because they're not selling to domestic consumers, they're selling to foreign consumers. These two are similar issues. The first one is about carbon emission. The second one is really about protecting our manufacturers' competitiveness. Next here, I will highlight several key issues in designing a border adjustment for carbon tax. The first one is border adjustment eligibility. It means which products or industries would be eligible for a border adjustment. This is quite a complicated topic. As I mentioned earlier, ideally, we would want a border adjustment to cover as many goods and services as possible because they're trade neutral, and then all goods consumed within a jurisdiction should be subject to a tax. However, it might be administratively infeasible when it comes to determining each single product's carbon emissions. Yes, we do have some products that would be very straightforward to determine its carbon emissions, like a barrel of oil. It's very easy to determine its carbon content. However, when you go along the supply chain to downstream goods, like a coffee mug you're drinking from or the laptop you're using right now, it's actually getting complicated very quickly to determine the carbon emissions associated with the production processes. So in order to solve this problem, policymakers that are actually focusing on designing eligibility criteria for goods that are eligible for border adjustment. In the next slide, I will show you what different bills their design is for this criteria. But a common theme among all the criteria is that policymakers are trying to find a way to identify the most carbon intensive products, the heavy polluters, and then make those eligible for the border adjustment. The next one is how to set the magnitude of border adjustment. The question here is, should we treat countries differently in the border adjustment mechanism based on their domestic carbon pricing policies? Say you have a country right now. The country already has a carbon pricing policy, whether that's a carbon tax, cap and trade system, or command and control regulation. Should we account for that fact and then give them a credit? Based on my research, I don't think we should give a credit for foreign countries, regardless of their domestic carbon policies. And there are three major reasons to this. The very first one is this would violate the World Trade Organization's treaty, the most favored nation treaty. What this rule says is for all the members of WTO under the MFN treaty, if the United States gives some sort of treatment or favored trade pact for one country, that treatment needs to be given to all the remaining members of this treaty. So that literally says the United States cannot discriminate against different countries based on their domestic carbon pricing policies. The second reason is it's administratively almost impossible to do that. We're talking about thousands of products and dozens of countries. The US government would need to assign a carbon emission to each single product from every single country and then account for what is actually their carbon prices imposed on this product. It would require a lot of resources and time to do that. And even if the US government were able to do that, even more resources would be needed to make sure the data are accurate and also updated on a regular basis. The last reason is from a tax revenue standpoint. If the US decided to adjust its border adjustments to accommodate other countries' domestic carbon tax policies, then foreign governments would have incentives to max out their carbon tax to collect the revenue that could have been collected by the US government. The last design issue I would like to highlight is compliance with WTO rules. This is a very complicated topic I could spend hours talking about, but in the interest of time, I'll just highlight two main rules that would be applicable to this topic. There are the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, and Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, SCM. Both of these rules restrict the ways that countries can impose taxes on imported goods and then also provide rebates on exported goods. However, there is an exception. They do permit countries to border adjust their products based on where they're consumed rather than produced. So lastly, here I would like to give you a brief overview of how existing carbon bills and proposals design a border adjustment mechanism. The table here reviews 5 of the pending carbon tax bills currently in Congress, plus a carbon tax proposal by Brian Flannery and other experts in this field. The reason that I only included 5 bills here is because Climate Action Rebate Act and the Market Choice Act of 2019, the legislative language in their border adjustment section is quite similar to some of the bills listed here. And the Flannery proposal is included here is because they actually proposed a very specific and concrete framework to track carbon emissions through the supply chain. There are 4 columns in this table. The first 2 are about product eligibility criteria, The third one is what we just talked about, whether we should provide credit to foreign countries. The last one is how should we account carbon content of products. So let's take a quick look at the first two columns. As I mentioned, there hasn't been a consensus among policymakers on how to design the eligibility criteria. As you can see here, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act and the America Wins Act, they both specify products that are very carbon intensive, and they would be the only ones that are eligible for border adjustment. The SWAP Act takes a different approach. They look at products that are both greenhouse gas intensive and trade intensive. The American Opportunity Carbon Fee Act, the legislative language in the proposal says for any product, if the energy intensity in the production process is more than 5%, then they would be eligible. Although more information would be needed to know how actually one can calculate the energy intensity for a product. The third column here, as you can see, most of the carbon tax bills and proposals do not give a credit for foreign countries. Only the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act and the American Opportunity Carbon Fee Act. They say if a foreign country has a domestic carbon pricing policy, then we would give them a credit. And lastly, the carbon accounting method column here, I would only highlight the last row. Under the Flannery proposal, they actually have a very nicely written out framework on how to track accumulative carbon emissions through a supply chain for both upstream products and downstream products. I would strongly encourage you to take a look at their report if you're interested in this topic. And that concludes my presentation today. I have an upcoming white paper that will be published on the Niskanen website very soon that covers all these topics in details. If you're interested in learning more about it, I encourage you to go give it a read. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Robert, for his presentation.
Thanks, Yuting. I'm here to talk about strategies to improve healthcare access through increasing the supply of providers. Got a PowerPoint. Okay. So basically, the problem is the United States does not have very many doctors. And why that's the problem is we see many people dealing with difficulties in paying for their health care, long wait times, and that this issue is particularly acute in rural areas. And in fact, our poor sort of number of doctors when compared internationally to countries, especially in Europe, sort of understates how bad it is, because we have so many of our doctors in sort of specialty roles like surgery, and far less of them in general practitioner roles who do sort of the first line treatments and diagnoses. So it's quite tough for many in the United States in comparison to other developed countries in Europe. And so there are basically two ways to get doctors. You can train them yourself through a graduate education, which comes after a bachelor's degree, or you can import them from other countries who train them at their universities. In the United States, there's very little of um, on sort of adjusted basis. The United States only beats Turkey out of OECD countries for which data is available in an average of the past 5 years in which there's data available. And so if we want healthcare to be as accessible as it is in Europe, we're going to need to do something, or maybe many things, in order to address this. And so here are 3 potential strategies we could use to address this. We could sort of attempt to address the domestic pipeline inadequacies that are not producing enough doctors for our citizens. We could expand international migration from countries that train the doctors there and then they come here and provide their services. Or we could expand scope of practice authorities for physician assistants, nurse practitioners, and other roles to allow them to do more things, more treatments, procedures, duties that are currently only performed by doctors. And so the barriers to education and medical training in the United States are quite substantial. Just looking at the price tag, it will take a doctor around $800,000 in terms of investing in education, a bachelor's degree and medical school in order to become a resident. A medical residency is sort of an early stage in the doctor's career. And in that period, they have reduced wages. So it is a significant investment. It's exacerbated by how much more expensive education is in the United States. So really, it's quite a big problem. And on top of that, we have significant licensure-related barriers, more sort of layers of fees and so on, which I'll expand on in the next few slides. Oh, so in terms of medical education, we can sort of see from this chart here that the United States, from the time you graduate from high school to the time that you finish your higher education, you will spend more years than any other country apart from Canada in education. And this is part of the cost problem. School is extremely expensive. The more time you spend in it, the more money you're paying. And in this way, by having a 4-year bachelor's degree as a prerequisite to medical school, these aspiring physicians are paying a lot of money, and oftentimes the coursework obtained within a bachelor's degree, it's not very relevant to medical school. Sort of the preferred route may be to adopt a sort of parallel track similar to countries like Australia, which have a 6-year degree that's consolidated, in addition to giving people the option of doing the 4-year bachelor's, 4-year medical school. And so once people get out of their education period, they deal with the licensing system in the United States. And in comparison to a lot of countries, particularly those in Scandinavia, this is quite expensive and burdensome. You're facing between with immigration, 35 and $1,425 every few years in terms of fees that you're paying to these medical boards. In addition to that, you're also paying for your DEA number, which is another round of fees. In Denmark and Sweden, well, for Denmark in particular, if you graduate from a Danish university, you pay nothing. That's it. You're automatically licensed. The university does it for you. And it's a similar case can be in said of Sweden, which is very streamlined. In addition to this, practitioners can only practice in the single state that they're licensed, with some sort of few exceptions. This specific chart shows for other professions, but the IMLC is what coordinates for physicians. And for these professions, they still have to pay the licensing fee in every single state. This could be over $10,000 every few years if you were to try to get licensed in all of them. And for this reason, very few do, only 14 in the whole country. But over 22% are licensed in 2 or more states. So they're paying a substantial amount of money. In addition to reforming the domestic pipeline, we could allow more immigration. I'm not going to say too much on this. There are obvious problems here. We've sort of closed off certain visas specifically to doctors. The TN visa for high-skilled immigrants between Mexico and Canada, it says doctors can only do teaching and research. They cannot come to the United States for the purpose of doing medicine. There's a ton we could do to expand visas for these people trying to practice medicine in the United States. Finally, we can implement scope of practice reforms, and these allow physician assistants and nurse practitioners to perform medical duties traditionally restricted to doctors. Just to give you an idea of what the landscape looks like here, a lot of states have done something like this, but often it's quite limited and it has a lot of strings attached. Ideally, we'd like to get to a point where basic, routine medical care, primary care is done by these providers, which require a lot less investments and therefore are more likely to be okay with taking the relatively lower wages associated with primary care. And I'll skip that slide. And so all of these are good paths. They would all improve the supply of medical care in the country. Why not do all three? And that's my presentation.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, Shu-Ting, and Robert. One of my the greatest pleasures for me in working at Niskanen is getting to work with such brilliant colleagues who are doing such innovative work. And as we said at the beginning, we're open for questions, so please feel free to submit some. I have a few of my own. It looks like we have a few rolling in, and we have about 15 minutes left in the presentation, so we should have plenty of time to get to these questions. So I'll start with the first one, and I believe it's an immigration question. So Jeremy, you're on deck. The other great part about moderating these is I don't get the hard questions, just the easy ones. All right. So this is a bit of a longer question, so I'm gonna have to read through it a little bit, and then I'll turn it over to Jeremy to handle the hard stuff. So regarding the research on immigration policy and OPT, I'm not sure I understand completely, but I think the impact on the native income and employment looked at Americans in the same companies or areas And if so, that would be Americans who did manage to get technical degrees in employment. So similarly situated people, it sounds like. What would be the potential impacts on Americans who are not able to get comparable technical training because of university placements occupied by foreign students, the high expense of American university education, and fewer subsidies compared with other countries? So that is to say, if American companies can simply hire people educated abroad, isn't that a disincentive to support the education of Americans? That's a big question. So I'm glad to be turning it over.
That's a really great question. So the first thing to notice about OPT is that these are people who are immigrated here. So who are educated here and not educated abroad, which does a couple of things for U.S. Which affords new opportunities for U.S. prospects for higher education, because by making international education more attractive to international students, by the prospect of OPT, it increases the interest. It increases the number of international students in U.S. higher education, which effectively subsidizes native tuitions and helps contribute to higher education as an export industry, which again just generally makes it cheaper for Americans who are interested in pursuing higher education. I don't think it's right to think of individuals who are here as international students as occupying seats that could otherwise go to natives. In general, when we look at higher education, it seems to be more of an effective subsidy where they're keeping tuition for natives down, and they're not displacing them because the number of seats, especially in the long run, isn't fixed, and colleges can expand the international education programs without denying seats to natives. The other point I would raise is that my research doesn't show that the benefits accrue only to those with comparable educations to those on OPT. So while it is true that the bulk of the benefits go to people with bachelor's and higher graduate degrees, the effect on those with only a high school diploma or those without a high school diploma at all is still positive. It's not as large as the benefit of someone who's working directly on a team with an OPT participant and who's benefiting from all of those ideas, but they are still benefiting from a more productive economy in general, and they do see an earnings bump if there are more OPT participants in their area. And the last point I would say in regard to the question about people without the opportunities for similar training is that not only do OPT students subsidize American technical training through subsidizing American tuition, they also do it through technical skills training grants, which when they adjust to H-1B status, which is the goal for many OPT participants, their employers will pay into a fund at the Department of Labor for natives job training. And there's a number of different grants programs that are all designed to help with technical training of natives, and $500 million worth of these programs would disappear if the H-1B component of OPT participants was cut off, and those funds never ended up in those grants programs. There would be ways to improve that. So for instance, if the H-1B program were reformed to allocate H-1Bs rather by lottery, but assigned visas to the highest earnings contract. So if the employer is willing to pay that H-1B worker more, which tends to be the case with OPT participants as opposed to other potential H-1B petitioners. So in those cases, if the H-1Bs were reserved for the people who were willing to pay more, and then you could have the fees that went to those technical skills training grants be a proportion of the earnings of the H-1Bs, that could increase the amount of resources available for those technical grants. But the bottom line is, right now, both of these programs, improve the prospects for Americans to get technical training, and they improve the prospects for Americans who don't have that training. And while there would definitely be ways to capitalize on that further, the effect, even under the status quo, is positive. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Jeremy. It reminds me that a rising tide lifts all ships. Our next question, I think, is directed for Shu-Ting. Is it possible to border adjust imported products with the current very complicated global supply chain? This is a great question. I think something we're seeing kind of play out in real time with COVID and the crisis.
Yeah, thank you, Kodiak. I think this is indeed a great question. So if you think about it, we live in a world with global trade. You might look at the laptop right now, it's actually made out of different pieces produced in maybe China, Canada, Mexico, and then assembled in a fourth country and then ship it back to the United States. So some people would ask the question, like, how do I even begin to determine the carbon emissions associated with imported products with such complex and long supply chains? There is a way to work around it. Experts have studied this for a long time, and they propose a way to tax imported products as if they're equivalent to domestically manufactured product. We call it a like approach. So we have imported good, for example, like a car, we would try to match it with a domestically manufactured car in the States based on their predominant production technology or the advanced technology, and then we'll levy the same amount of carbon tax on that imported product. So it is definitely challenging, but not impossible. Actually, I published a blog post on this topic yesterday on the Niskanen's website. So if you're interested in learning more about it, go take a quick look at my blog post. Thank you.
So that blog post is on niscanencenter.org?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that answer, Shu-Ting. And we have another question that's come in, and I think we can all take a crack at this, but certainly this feels like it hits on my wheelhouse, government affairs. Is COVID-19 sucking up all the oxygen on Capitol Hill? Are you having discussions with members and staff on other policy issues like immigration, climate, and healthcare? And just the top level overview, and then I'll hand it over to my colleagues. I think COVID-19 is certainly taking up a lot of bandwidth these days, but as we're moving through this crisis and we are moving through the various stages of relief, I think we are seeing an increased willingness to have more policy discussions. And certainly, even in the event of a crisis, some of these larger issues don't really go anywhere. So I think there's a limited amount of time before the election to really move on substantive policy issues, but I do think we still have great relationships on the Hill and are having very thoughtful conversations about a lot of these issues. And I think Jeremy and the immigration team are still doing a lot of very important work. I know the climate policy department's working very hard, although it doesn't seem like the right time necessarily to promote a tax, a carbon tax. There may be some ways that our other policy areas are applicable to this crisis and can gain some traction. And I think Robert's presentation really hit on some of the systemic issues in our healthcare system. So I will turn it over to my three co-panelists in case they have any final thoughts before we're out of time.
Yeah, thanks, Kodiak. I think you hit the nail on the head. It seems like I don't think that it's necessarily a trade-off between either looking at immigration or COVID-19. Like you said, that Robert's presentation touched on the ways that those two issues intersect. I know there's right now a lot of interest in making sure that immigration restrictions aren't stopping those healthcare workers who are working on the front lines of the COVID-19 response and contributing to a shortage of those workers. And there's interest in working on that and other issues that, again, are sort of at that nexus of the two.
Well, thank you so much to everyone who spent their afternoon with us. Thank you so much to Jeremy Shooting and Robert. You're doing some really incredible work, and it's a pleasure to work with you. A recording of this webinar will be available, and we would encourage everyone who participated today to take a look at niskanencenter.org. There's some great white papers and blog posts there that get a little bit further into what our presenters talked about today. And I hope everyone stays healthy and safe. And please tune in for our next webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.